want to switch now from the American and global nature of this war to what's really happening in Yemen. And as a way to do that, could all of you kind of look at what you see as the causes and scope of the humanitarian crisis? And I know, Scott, you've done a lot of work on this. But what really you see as like defining the war in Yemen? And I'm going to put up the map of who controls what as that.
I have a short pitch on this, so bear with me. I've now said this a few times. Because Americans are often intimidated by complex crises in the Middle East, I've tried my best to break down the drivers of the crisis to 4 I words. So hopefully everybody will be able to follow along. The first of the I's is inequality. This is a baseline condition for Yemen that defines the distribution of economic and social power across the country by class. There are a group of exceptionally wealthy people who have profited from state resources and natural resources for a very long time. There are also a group of people who are so socially and economically marginalized that they're not fully integrated into the rest of society. And so the bottom rung of that that society was already in humanitarian crisis before the war escalated in 2015. And what has basically happened since then is everybody who is not wealthy or middle class is feeling a huge amount of pain and pressure on their ability to live with any sort of dignity. And so that's a concept that came before the conflict, but along which suffering falls pretty accurately. It's inequality. The second is institutions. I'm talking here about government institutions mostly, but also private sector institutions, which have been decimated by the war. They've been decimated by bad governance, they've been decimated by a faltering economy, and also by politicization of 2 parties to the conflict, which each claim command responsibility, if you'll allow me to use a military term. It's not really management responsibility, let's say, over the work of ministries responsible for providing social services. So we don't have the same kind of education service, health service, social welfare networks that we had a few years ago. So that's institutions. Third is infrastructure. Here I'm talking about critical civilian infrastructure across the country that's been destroyed by the war. Most health centers and hospitals have been damaged or destroyed since the beginning of the escalation of the conflict in 2015. Many, many schools, markets, private businesses, roads, bridges, port infrastructure has been obliterated by something in between gross recklessness and intended strikes by parties to the conflict. So that's institutions, that's infrastructure. And the fourth is imports. Yemen has always been, or for a very long time has been, an import-dependent country, specifically to meet its needs for food and fuel. Since the conflict escalated in 2015, the Saudi-led coalition has imposed what we would call a de facto blockade on the country. And what I mean by that is it's imposed a set of restrictions and inspections and other measures of interference that have caused such extensive delays that the price for these basic household commodities have escalated massively. So between that, a lack of people's ability to earn a regular income, and inflation, people just have less money to pay higher prices for the things they need most to survive. So to break that down on a human level, if you've seen a picture of a malnourished child in a newspaper, it's useful actually to think through and zoom out what situation that child is in. So that child is going to be living in a town or a city or a village that likely has all of the things one would need to survive. It will likely have food, it will likely have some access to other basic household commodities, but the family won't be able to afford it. And when the body becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, there isn't adequate health service or shelter or other public services to support that child. And lastly, just also bear in mind that child is possibly surrounded by siblings, possibly surrounded by parents, who are making decisions on a daily basis about the best interests of this child. And only after taking a series of desperate measures that might include anything from approving an older child's decision to go off and fight in a militia for a salary, or spending the last amount of money on medicine for another child, and as a result not having enough to feed this one, or consenting to marry off one of their daughters, even though they might not want to marry their daughters at an early age. Those are the kinds of decisions that Yemeni families are making that are leaving that child in the position that you see his picture or her picture on a newspaper or a magazine.
One sort of element of the conflict that is not seen much internationally or in the media is the breakdown of certain elements of Yemeni society. And this is a driver of, it's one of the reasons why, the conflict keeps going on so long, and it's also a major humanitarian factor, I think, because a lot of the sort of social structures and social fabric that could otherwise help the population be more resilient and resistant to crises has collapsed. No country that's going through the scale of a crisis as Yemen is can survive just on sort of traditional social structures and cohesion, but this is a big problem. So particularly in the north of Yemen, since 2011-ish, you've seen a complete breakdown in the traditional tribal structures that most people live within. The order of society, of families and sort of inter-family relations and territorial control and regional identity. These things have broken down. A lot of that has to do with the way that the Houthi movement waged its battle for control of the north over the last decade and a half or so, but a lot of it is other sort of festering economic problems, social and political influence from the Yemeni regime and from outside powers. So you've seen these structures that used to sort of, at least to some extent, take care of most Yemenis or guide most Yemenis' lives and the distribution of resources in society collapse, so that there's not much to rely upon for the average person. The government is non-existent. The tribe is no longer a presence. Families are broken, and that's a big, not just humanitarian problem, but it's also, again, a driver of conflict because new power struggles rise up to sort of replace these social institutions that used to exist, and people are sort of in the wind and looking for different ways to make sense of their world and also to exert some sort of agency over the world. And in the midst of a multifaceted war, one of the ways to do that is to start fighting. So you are sort of, this instability is pushing more people into the conflict at the ground level, and it's exacerbating the situational drivers of the conflict as well.
Also, this instability is creating almost a new set of identities, new social groups, new political groups. And these political groups, for most of the time, are antagonistic. Most of the time, the conflict in Yemen is framed as sectarian in the West. And I think that's a huge, huge misconception. Yes, sectarianism mattered, and it's a consequence of the conflict, but it was not driver. So you see old families and old villages, they were cooperative, helping each other. Now they're divided along sectarian, Zaidi, Sunni, Shia, North, South, Qaeda, non-Qaeda. And I think these identities, can only contribute to the instability, can only contribute to breaking down the social fabric. And in a society like Yemen, where a big part of it was tribal, much of this public provision is dependent on the social cohesion. It is dependent on the tribe as a unit. It's dependent on the big family as a unit. And I think what is happening lately with the whole sectarianism and many factions politicized and polarized, that's also a huge contributing factor. You see families who lived in the north moving to the south. They're being met with hostility from southerners. Even though they're victims from the north, they go back to the north. Oh, you came from the south. You're with the Saudis and the government. Then you're against Houthis, and back and forth. So you see many families relocating across different cities and different provinces because they're trying to navigate a new set of identities that the conflict created, and they had been antagonistic and detrimental.